Hey, Mark, I'm happy to be here with you today to talk about the last 15 minutes of the Jordan Peterson-John Vervaeke conversation. And I don't know if it's going to be possible for us to get through the 15 minutes, but we'll give it the old heave-ho. I think a big part of it is the whole focus on Heidegger and where Heidegger went wrong, and a warning to the rest of us to keep our eyes open about what the potential is for going wrong. And so do you have anything you want to say before I spring the video on us and we start looking at it?
Yeah, well, thanks. I'm glad we're getting a chance to round this out. But yeah, it's going to be a long 15 minutes, that's for sure, because there's so much here. And yeah, you're right. I think the problem with many of the modern philosophers like Kant and Heidegger and Nietzsche are their core axioms are usually obviously wrong. And people like, well, let's just assume they're correct. And then we continue onward. And then all their projects end in disaster because the starting point was sort of corrupted at the beginning or something, right? I think that's going to show through. I don't think it showed through here, but I've since learned a bunch about Kant and Heidegger in particular. I was like, really? Somebody listened to these guys? After they said that, it's sort of shocking. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be great fun.
Okay, so originally I said we were going to start at 2 hours, 16 minutes and 30 seconds, but I want to back it up just a little bit so that our viewers kind of remember where they're at. So I'm going to start at 2:15 and then we'll go forward for a couple, 2.5 minutes maybe, and then we'll pick up at a reasonable spot. Let's see, there we go. And I thought I had it set up and I didn't, but there we go.
Not power.
Right.
When it's look, I mean, we deserve to be criticized. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that things are above criticism and that power doesn't play its nefarious role, because it certainly does. And so does the love of power, all of that. Yes. And it leads to terrible consequences. But we're actually trying to analyze that. And we're trying to say, look, it's what you have to pursue wisdom. And you find the pathway to wisdom in meaning, in the manifestation of meaning as an experiential phenomenon.
I agree with that. And I think, I mean, a few minutes ago, you sounded like Derrida, and I don't mean that as any kind of insult. Now you're sounding like Heidegger. I mean, the question concerning technology was the whole idea that we have reduced our relationship to the world as a relationship of power. And we even think, right?
That's his claim. I see. I see. I didn't understand that exactly.
Yeah, that's the fundamental claim. And so we
power, control. Oh, that's why David Suzuki criticizes the West and Genesis, because he sees that he's responding to that mastery as control phenomena, power.
Yes.
Right, rather than the dance. Heidegger, but I think when it's done right, it's the dance. Heidegger is worried that the dance will be reduced to power, which I suppose makes his dalliance with Nazism all that more.
Yeah, well, I think Rakowski is right.
A warning.
Yeah, if Heidegger had kept to his original reading of Plato, instead of turning and making Plato sort of the villain in his story of the history of nihilism, Rakowski makes a great argument that is what sort of sensitizes Heidegger to the Nazis. And so Heidegger basically gets Platonism, he gets it, and then he inverts his interpretation. And it looks for kind of suspicious reasons that he does that. And then he recasts Plato.
I also wonder.
Okay, so maybe we should stop there for a second. He's moving kind of fast there. He's saying that Derrida's claim is that there's this whole move towards power, and then JBP comes in talking about David Suzuki worried about mastery as control rather than seeing it as the dance. Obviously, Peterson is thinking of mastery as the dance. Do we want to riff on that a little bit, on how mastery as the dance is better framing than mastery as control?
Yeah, I think this is the core problem. Like, this is the core error they're all making. So what's happening is, if you put yourself first in the scientific frame, if you start thinking of things as one-to-one linear relationships, of course, power. There's no room for dance. You can't break dance down with science. So you're not going to see it. And I think it's a framing problem. And, which is a point they make. It's just that, again, they make these points. They don't take them seriously. They're not looking at the right order. I think Peterson is more so than Vervaeke. This idea of how to think critically comes from Kant. It's very much instead of what do we think about God, why do we think about God? That's actually the example that Hans Georg Müller uses in Carefree Wandering, which is something that PVK has been going through, right? So he kind of turned me onto that. And then I went and I'm like, oh, well, look at this slide on Kant is everything that's wrong with society today that I've noticed. Everything, it's all in Kant, right there. First one in the playlist on his Wandering Through Ideas. And how is the idea of God conditioned in reason? It's not. Like, if you start from the premise that it should be, and therefore we should understand the way we reason about God, you've already made a mistake. You're already making a framing error. And so Kant's already doing that.
Back it up a little bit. If you start from what premise?
From how is the idea of God conditioned in reason? It's not. God is not reasonable. Like, literally not reason. It's so ironic.
So hold on a second. Because McGilchrist makes a big point about the difference between reason and rationality. And so McGilchrist would probably say that how is the idea of God conditioned in rationality? It's not.
Right.
But it can be conditioned in reason, the way that he perceives reason, because he sees reason as a function of the right hemisphere of the brain.
Yeah, I don't think that's correct. I think we equivocate on reason, right? The thing that is given to us as a reason, or as reasons, those are goals. Not really, right? But they're closest to goals. That's provided by God. But that doesn't mean that we can reason our way to God or reason an understanding of God. I don't think that's possible.
Yeah, so it is just a misapprehend. It's a semantic issue.
It's equivocation on the word reason. Do you mean reason? Do you mean reason as a goal, or do you mean reason as a way of understanding something? Right, because there's no way for us to understand God because he's outside of our universe. Then
we're getting into the difference between knowing and understanding, which is one of the big arguments that's gone on. Wow, we're in a hole right now.
But that's where it starts, right? And that's where Heidegger went wrong, as he says explicitly at one point. He says basically, look, here's the problem: is that God can't be a being. Because beings can't create other beings, roughly speaking, or a being couldn't create all other beings, roughly speaking, right? And the problem is that's a critique of a 4-year-old. Like, that's a 4-year-old critique. That is not what the church says,
you mean
right?
It specifically says a being rather than just being?
Right. It's the difference between being as such and being as an ocean, right? Like, God is right, because we're equivocating on the word being, right? It's the same problem all over again. It's just that, look, words are limiting. Like, get over it. Like, words are propositional, and propositions can't contain this stuff. Sure. But Heidegger makes the confusion, and so does Vervaeke. I mean, Vervaeke takes this stuff way too seriously. He comes to the conclusion that the church believes that God is a being, and that therefore there's a conflict because God can't be a being, and therefore. And so he's making two errors. One is, no, that's not what the church says at all. That's what some people who understand it as, but maybe they can't understand it anymore any differently, right? Maybe they just don't have the cognitive capacity, and they don't need to. Like, that's the other thing. Like, well, everybody needs to. No, everybody does not need to. My farmer does not need to contemplate God and philosophy. Thank you very much. If they do, that's fine, but they don't need to. I just need them to grow food. They don't need to know anything about the nature of God or the church or any of it. Like, they don't need to worry about any of this stuff. They have a wonderful life compared to us. So we're agonizing over these things that can't feed us. So, that's where the error is. And then everybody goes, oh, Heidegger's absolutely right. This is a flaw in the church, including John. And then John talks to Bishop Barron and some other folks and, realizes, oh, the church fathers were all what I would call non-theists. Well, if the church fathers are non-theists, how is that a problem with the church? It sounds like a problem with people who attend church, and people who attend church have lots of problems, and that might be the least of them. So are you critiquing the church, or are you critiquing one or two people in the church? Or are you critiquing, worse yet, your impression of what the church is? Because that, I think, is what Heidegger's critiquing. But that's not a valid critique, because that's just—
Well, that happens with everybody, doesn't it?
Of course it does. But that's what you have to watch out for. Like, if your core axiom is that the church—
Is it possible for us to communicate without straw manning?
Right. Well, we have to
is that even
simplify.
possible?
What's the process of language? The process of language is simplifying and decomplexifying, right? And compression. Language is a compression. And so there's some loss in there. But the question is, do you catch these problems, these errors, when they're made? And, I tend to catch them. The minute Kant says, well, I've changed the nature of critique, I go, wait a minute. Do you have the authority to do that, buddy? Like, are you sure you can just gin up a new type of critique? When Heidegger goes, well, the church believes, I'm like, is the church an agent? Do they have a belief? Right? No, the church does not believe a thing, because the church is not a thing. It's a body of things, which is it's the same mistake all over again, right? And so the church doesn't even have the capacity to do what you're talking about. And maybe people get that out of the church, fair enough, but that's individual people. And so you have to keep the blame where it belongs. If individual people don't understand God as a being outside of time and space, roughly speaking, then they don't. But also they don't need to, right? It's that grave error about, well, everybody needs to know what I know, because if everybody knew what I knew, they'd see the world the way I see it, and they'd come to the same conclusions about it, and then we'd all do the same thing. And it's like, none of those assumptions are true.
So it's your story there about the church as a body is very interesting. It makes me think about a lot of things, but the first picture that jumped into my mind is an article that I read yesterday, or maybe it was this morning. It's actually an obituary of a guy that was a jazz guitarist in his life. And when he was in his late 20s, he experienced some issues with his thinking and with his guitar playing and everything, and went through a lot of different diagnoses. And eventually they discovered that there was some sort of a tumor with a lot of tendrils wrapped around something in his brain, and he had surgery. And when they removed the tumor, he woke up and all of his memories were wiped. He had total amnesia. And he had no memory of anything that had ever happened in his life. So he wakes up, these two people are standing at his bedside. They're his parents. He has no idea who they are. He has no idea that he ever played guitar. All of these things are just gone, right? Now, the obituary goes on to say that his parents worked with him and helped him and showed him pictures of his past and showed him videos of himself or played him recordings of himself playing the jazz guitar. And he said, it wasn't easy, but over time, it was as though little bits of myself came back to me from different places inside me. So it's like the center of all the memories was gone, but the embodied memories were still there. Those parts of his being still had little intimations. And those little intimations eventually all came back together and helped him to rebuild his memory. And he taught himself to play again and went on to become a very significant jazz guitarist for the rest of his life. And he just died at the age of 77. And I thought, wow, what a picture, of, so the church is the body. I think sometimes the church acts as though it's that control center in the brain, right?
Right.
But even if the control center in the brain is removed, the body is still going to be there and have the embodied memories of what it means to know the truth. So the church is not the repository. The church leaders are not the repository of truth.
Right. Exactly. Right? Exactly.
Yeah. Now, the other thing I want to say about mastery being a dance rather than being an issue of control is the whole thing that I learned through art. And that is that your vision always outruns your skill. So you can have a picture of what you want to accomplish, what you want to achieve, the thing that you want to create, and you do it and it just doesn't match up to what you wanted it to match up to. But it shows you where you need to grow and what you need to learn. And then you learn those things and then you find out, wait a minute, my vision has moved on now and is higher yet. So I have to learn some more to get there. And that to me is the dance. That mastery is this continual dance with my future self. And it's and control is more, I've achieved and you need to listen to me because I know, right? And so there's this big difference between I know more than you do, and wait, I don't know enough, I don't know as much as I need to know, right? So there's that contrast.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I like that example, right? Because you've got that aspirational vision that you're moving towards. It's for Vicky talks about aspiration, but not much. He just says, Agnes Keller. But you've got that aspirational vision that you're, moving towards. And then to get there, you have to surpass yourself, right? You have to beat yourself. That's what you're doing constantly in order to get to that vision. And like, where does that vision come from if it's not within you, right? If it's bigger than you, and then back to the body, like we need a body, a community at the very least. If it's a church, right? But you need that body as a place to have that dance and to have that strength with others, because you're insufficient. So this is the problem. You're insufficient, right? And so you need that to help you. You need other people to help you, to make you better than you could be without them. And that's why you need a body. And also I would say, the body is the place where, that can facilitate your transformation and also help with it. Is it a good transformation or a bad one? Because that's a problem. Are you still oriented in the same direction with your transformation that you thought you should be? Other people have to help you with that. We outsource our sanity. So all of that is built in. It's stuff that John sort of skirts around in some sense that he needs to cover more, in my opinion, is transformation and the role of community.
Well, and the role of community is such that, this is such a big idea, but my husband is a big stock market fan, and he'll always say the market is so comprehensive and so smart. It just automatically knows. And the market is like the body. Because there's too much information, there's too many areas of transformation needed in my life for me to figure out the path forward. In a communist world, they think they can figure everything out from the top down, but I don't know all the places that need to be transformed in me. And like you said, we outsource our sanity. Other people show us where we need to be transformed, either by telling us or by our looking at them and thinking, oh, I'm very weak in that area. I need some mentoring in that area. So that's one thing. But then because there are so many different parts of me that need realignment, there need to be many, many different people in my life who can help me with those things. And so like in art, the one thing I love about working in the art world is that usually artists are very, very generous with their information and their know-how and their help. And so as an artist, you always want to be helping the people that aren't as far along as you are, and you want to be getting help from the people who are further along than you are. So we have that art string, but then we have many, many other strings in our life that have that same situation where we need to be mentored and we need to be mentoring. And the church is the place where all that happens in terms of transformation.
Yeah, well said. And I wonder how many of these philosophers didn't have that. And so they weren't able to transcend because they point to it, right? Heidegger flips on Plato and says, no, Plato's a bad guy. We're going to get rid of this guy, right? And then that it's not clear, right? Even Peterson says not clear which came first. Was it the ego trip that came first? Was the ego trip the result of, right? Doesn't really matter in some sense. He never got past Plato. And I think that's interesting. So if you take somebody as late as Heidegger, he never got past Plato. What about all these other guys? Did they ever get past Plato? Right? It's like, well, if none of them got past Plato, maybe the answer is too simple for smart people to understand.
Well, what is it about Plato and Aristotle that all of history since then has bounced back and forth between those two guys? we think of ourselves as being these highly evolved beings, but everybody always goes back, either looking at what they had to say and building off of it, or looking at what they had to say and fighting against it. And, you know,
Yeah. Well, I'd say two things about that. My buddy Jack has a podcast called Ancient Greece Declassified, and it is excellent. I really like Jack. He's a great guy. I met him on Clubhouse, and in one of the, I think it's the later podcasts that he did, he kind of talks about this. Plato and Aristotle are not actually in conflict all that much. They first of all, Aristotle learned from Plato, so a lot of it's just emphasis. Like Plato's sort of emphasizing over here and Aristotle's emphasizing over there, and they're not in conflict, or at least not much. And I think that's important. But the interesting thing is, you know, again, what if they did find the answer? Like, what if they found the end? And it's just that simple. Like, they just have the end, and you can't get any more complex than that and make it better. And I think that's part of the problem. Like, it doesn't look like Nietzsche got past Plato. Heidegger didn't get past Plato. Nobody's getting past Plato. Fair enough. Like, if you're not getting past Plato, then you're not getting past Plato. Why are you still trying? Because at a certain point, you got to figure, like, all these people, all this time, no one's gotten any further. Maybe there's no further to go. And maybe you'd like there to be. I get that. And you'd like to be the person to do it, which is the trap they were trying. Heidegger wanted to get past Plato, and he was so desperate that he just miscast Plato as a villain and said, aha, and therefore, now I'm smarter than Plato. Maybe you're not. Maybe Plato was the smartest guy who ever lived. I don't know. Could be. I'm not trying to get past Plato. I don't see any flaws in Plato to get past.
Let's just try to get past these 15 minutes with John between Peterson and Vervaeke. Let's listen to a little bit more of what they had to say.
Or as a dreadful warning about the dreadful attractiveness of precisely such things to the unprepared mind.
Well,
I mean, Heidegger's a mind to be contend with, so that's a terrible warning.
For sure. And I mean, Heidegger's deep reading of, yeah, I mean, and you know, people have wrestled with this, you know, like Rakowski, like Derrida, about just like, why does Heidegger end up here? And well, like I said, I think Rakowski makes a very good argument, but it's deeply perplexing, because what's happening in Heidegger reads Nietzsche very deeply, and then what he sees that he wants to reconstitute fundamental ontology so that our primary relationship to being is not will to power. He wants to get outside the power framework, which is the question concerning technology and all of this stuff. And, you know, my friend Johannes Niederhauser.
Yes, and that's driving the positive side of the environmentalism movement as well, right? Let's say the desire for a dance rather than for the imposition of power.
This is Heidegger appropriating Eckhart's term, Gelassenheit. Gelassenheit is this idea of letting be, not in the passive sense, but the way you let your partner be when you're dancing together, right? The affording. And Heidegger says what we've done is we instead of that, we've turned everything into what he calls standing reserve. Everything
we're tempted. I see. That's the standing reserve idea. It's for the consumption of power.
Yes. And then our only relationship, and this is Fromm's critique, right? The modal confusion, that we are trapped in the having mode. But you'd say then it would be a propositional materialism that would lead to that outcome, because if it's dead matter that we're dealing with, then that's the logical consequence of that. That's the logical moral consequence of that. What would you say? It's a stance that's supposed to be outside the moral world, right? So the objective world is dead material. Well, what do you do with dead material? You store it for, are you not inevitably tempted to store it for the consumption of power? Exactly.
Wow. So when he first mentioned that about the standing reserve, I was reaching in my head, what on earth are they talking about? But then when he reframed it at the end like that, the objective world is dead material, supposedly. Are you not tempted to store it for the consumption of power?
Yeah, if you start from that frame, and why is the objective world dead material? Because there's nothing there to enchant it. And so people have a point when they say what we need is re-enchantment, and they go to the mystics. They go to the mystic tradition, because that mystics is heavy enchantment, low materialism, roughly speaking. But this all started with Kant, because Kant said, look, we can question the framing of religion as such and use philosophy to do it. Philosophy doesn't have to be the handmaiden of religion. It's like, no, it does. Because otherwise objects become material only and have no spirit, because you just push the spirit out or tried to ward it off using the tools of science. And that's not good. And everybody since then has been adopting Kant's axiomatic precepts as though they're true when they're obviously not. And the ancient Greeks didn't think this way at all. That's why they never ran into this problem. They're like, no, duh, don't be stupid. Smack, smack.
Well, so Kant obviously had an agenda. Do you have any idea what motivated his agenda?
Oh no, I don't. I just, like I said, I watched Carefree Wanderings, and that first one in the playlist just outlines all the problems that we have, which is Kant invented postmodern critique. He said, oh, science has been successful and philosophy hasn't, which is an error. Natural science is natural philosophy, according to the Greeks. It's a subtype. If science is successful, philosophy is also successful, right? So it's just an error on his part, because he doesn't know what philosophy is, roughly speaking. So he's a philosopher that has no idea what the definition of philosophy is. That's how I would characterize Kant and everybody after him, apparently, because they all adopt this. And then he says we should therefore use the tools of this subgroup of philosophy for all philosophy to make it more successful. That's another error. That's a different error, right? And then he decouples philosophy as being the handmaiden of religion, and says we can use this new form of critique. Why do we think of God, rather than how do we think of God or something, as a way to make philosophy primal in the world. But when you do that, when you use reason, logic, and rationality to divide up the world, it becomes objects, and only objects, dead objects, just like Peterson described. And so you're inevitably stuck in this power thing. Sure, because you have no choice. But you could not step in that hole. And then you don't have these problems are all created problems. If you don't create the problems, you don't have to solve them.
Well, I think those problems arose much earlier than Kant, but Kant just found a way to frame it so that the people of his day would latch onto it and go, oh yes, finally we have a champion who can give us a way forward to go the way we want to go, because people always go the way they want to go, right?
Yeah, well, and that's what they're speaking to, right? Like Heidegger very much wants to be smarter than Plato, wants to get past Plato. And so he finds a way to do it, right? And bang, he becomes a Nazi. Well, that's weird, right? And without looking at the end result, and see, there's a lot of this, and you heard it in here. It's like, well, no, we can figure out why Heidegger went wrong. No, but we can observe that he went wrong and not go that way. Isn't that a better right? Look, why are you taking him seriously if you know his path is wrong? Oh, look, this guy ran off a cliff. Let's go through his path and see if we can avoid running off the cliff. No, just don't go that way. Like, why do you feel compelled to do that move? It's crazy. It's a bad move. He ran off a cliff and did a bad thing. Okay, fair enough. Don't go that way. Put up a sign, do not pass.
Okay, but you're starting with assumptions that your listeners don't have with you. So what are your underlying assumptions when you say that? When you say, don't jump off that cliff, can't you see? Obviously, you see something that you think they can't see. So what is it that you see that you think they can't see?
Yeah, well, one problem I have is I see the end of every argument from its start, like right away. I know where that leads. I've been there before in argumentation, or you can just see the pattern, and it's like, oh, that pattern always ends this way. Don't start that pattern. And then, I always took seriously the idea of the Greeks that religion is a given. If you said the word religion, I was watching a show a few days ago even on the kingdom of Urartu, which is roughly Armenia. But it's an ancient kingdom, right? They're up there fighting with the Assyrians. It's back, in Babylon and all that stuff. And the guy was actually asked him, like, he said, well, the temple for the Urartu Empire was outside of their boundaries, roughly speaking, although This gets into, did they really have boundaries the way we think of them? No, they didn't. So they had to travel. And then at one point, the Assyrians come up and sack their temple. But it's not just their temple, right? Because it's not how it worked in the ancient world. Religion was an assumption of, like, they didn't understand the word religion. And the professor comes right out and says this. He said, they didn't have no concept of religion. It was just everyday
Tom Holland
life.
talks about that, yeah, that religion was an idea, and the whole religion as an idea and secularism as an idea are constructs that have, you know, come about in history, not back then. So
Well, they emerge as a result of science and philosophy, because you have to draw a box that says, well, what is philosophy? Well, now we have to discern it from the things that can't be philosophy. And the ancient Greeks knew what that was because they had religion, roughly speaking. And so everything that wasn't religion was philosophy, or a type of philosophy. Fair enough. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, because the thing that creates all the things is outside of us. It's outside of the universe as such, right? It's not that God's hanging out in the universe and like doing stuff. It's that God created the universe. Like, that's a totally different statement. And so he's not a being the way we're beings, but he is the being that created being, which is a different, right? But you have to understand that nuance, and it is a nuance. But science is the one that says, no, there's two worlds. And here's the non-science world, and here's the other. But the thing is, that's a definition of the constraint of science. The whole point of talking about science was to create a box where science felt comfortable, had a framing to operate within, and could make statements. But that box is limited. It's not all of reality. Science doesn't tell you about all of reality, because most of reality is religious or spiritual.
So the danger of the scientism people is that they are looking at science as being the whole thing. But the beauty of Western civilization is that Western civilization allowed the human mind to develop in a way that it could put those constraints on that would create a box within which certain findings could be illuminated through observation. And where I think it falls off the cliff is, you know, I don't know if you've ever watched that lecture by Nima Arkani Hamed on the fundamental morality. I can never remember the name of the lecture, but anyway, the point of his whole lecture, and he's a highly regarded physicist, an atheist, but the point of his whole lecture is that it's very strange to him that embedded within the practice of physics and of science itself is the necessity of having a highly refined sense of moral truth, and that you must adhere to truth if you're going to do science. Because if you're willing to accept just any old result, you're not going to get anywhere. And the result that you get has to be abiding by the truth. So you're always moving to a higher truth. And he shows a picture of these two mountains. The first mountain is a smaller mountain, the pinnacle of which is Newtonian physics, because Newton's idea of gravity made possible all of our space flights and everything else, okay? But then along comes Einstein, and Einstein is at the pinnacle of a higher mountain, but both of those mountains are complete and consistent in themselves, and they're both pointing to a very crystalline, beautiful truth. And the truth of the next higher mountain does not destroy the truth of the earlier mountain. Both mountains are necessary. Right. And that's the whole move of science, is continually moving to the peak of these higher mountains. And of course, he doesn't say it, but there is the old saying that someday they're going to get to the top of the highest peak and they're going to find the rabbi, the priest, you know, sitting up there talking about it, because they've always known what that highest mountain is, right?
Yeah, it doesn't invalidate, right? There's scale in the world, and things work at different scales. And then once they're out of those scales, they don't work. And this is very much science is trying to get out of the scale that it's been confined in and break out and take over, but it can't. And it fails every time it tries.
So, but you said that every argument that you hear, you get to the end of it before you hear the argument. So what made you that kind of a person? How did you get to where you can see all the patterns, when a person first opens their mouth, how can you see the pattern of where they're going?
I don't know. I mean, my mother was pretty crazy, so she saw all kinds of things. My mother told me predictions and stuff that it is not possible that she was right about, but she was right about them. And she wasn't right at every prediction, but she was right with most of them. And I mean, really complex stuff like, oh, well, you know, this actor is definitely going to turn out to be gay in 5 years. It's like, what? And, you know, just got married, whatever, every time, things like that, every time. It was bizarre. And I don't know how she did it, because she could not have had the information, you know, unless she was getting it through some, you know, other method other than every other person on the planet. And she would just make these wild predictions about how the world was going to go and what was going to unfold and all of these things. And she would say things like, oh, in 10 years, this is going to turn out this way. And you know, on the other hand, she also saw things that definitely were not there and other people could not see. And she was aware of that fact. So she was able to spin very complicated stories to explain her inconsistencies. And I was also homeless. So when you're homeless, you tend to get real philosophical and say spiritual real fast. Because when you don't have food and water, and I didn't, or it's cold because it's the middle of New England and you're living in a car, it tends to clarify life for you in a way that few other things do. Not that I'm recommending any of this, right? But like in a pinch, if you want to be enlightened, go be homeless in New England in the winter. It'll happen. Don't worry, or you'll be dead. So, you know, there's a little caveat there because there's definitely a lot of suicide along the way.
So what you're talking about is the role of suffering in clarifying our thinking.
Yeah, roughly speaking. Well, and look, I mean, I was in Boston. Literally, I was in Boston, not just around Boston. I actually lived in Boston for a long time. Well, not for a long time, but for quite a while, in the surrounding towns, Somerville and Brookline and places like that. And I had access to very smart people. And like you could walk into MIT and Harvard in the day and just audit a class, and they didn't know you weren't even a student. They didn't even ask. You just walk in, listen to a lecture, whatever. And there were lots of people around that area. And, you know, we had philosophy nights. Tuesdays was philosophy night, it was open parlor night. We discussed philosophy. So we had all these philosophical discussions when I was growing up. So, you know, a lot of these arguments I've heard, they're not new. There's a limited number of arguments. It's tiny, believe it or not. And no one's gotten past Plato. That's like the summary of philosophy. So you don't need to get complicated. You can just go, oh, there you go. Plato, problem solved. Maybe add some Aristotle because Plato didn't have the full picture.
Has that been, have you been successful in persuading people to your point of view?
Oh, yeah. No, I meet with great success. Yeah. I mean, there are lots of limitations and it's not very successful, but when it's successful, it works really well. And I've gotten a lot of people out of nihilism, and not just me. I have a lot of help, right? Manuel Post is on the Discord server, the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server with me, right? We're helping people all the time. Just before I jumped on this call, I saw somebody on my server. I was talking to him, you know, and getting, but there's a whole technique, and obviously people are different. So my tactic only works with some small number of people, and it only works in limited circumstances. But I would say it's kind of like the AA effect. AA is terrible, but it's way better than the options. So my method is terrible, but it's way better than everybody else's.
Well, I mean, I don't think I've ever experienced your method, but the thing I find interesting, to me, it's the same thing that I find interesting in Vervaeke and Peterson, I find interesting in you. And that is, you all are saying things that have so many assumptions underlying there, so many things that, so much of a backstory that's in your head that you already know. And then you make statements about, well, obviously this is true, but to the person listening, they haven't followed your backstory all the way through. So it seems to me that if a person is willing to ask you questions to get at the backstory, they can learn a lot. But if they're not willing to go back and ask all those questions, they never find out how you got to where you were. So when you say, and you kind of always, you do this little sardonic laugh, when you say, well, obviously, the person listening is like, well, obviously how? How did you get there?
Right. Well,
Right.
it's a trick, right? So I'm extremely subversive. I was talking to Chris Petkow on his channel. I got a number of talks on his channel. The last one was really good. It's 2 hours and 44 minutes, but actually
I started listening, but I haven't finished it. So.
It's amazing. I don't, Chris was in front of me for most of it too, which is nice. He was like, I was kind of like, stop jumping ahead, Chris. I'm trying to tell a story. You know, but he's so sharp. He's really sharp. So he was on it. But when I do that, people get very upset. They're like, oh, you're making absolute statements. I'm like, yeah, I am, because you have to. And I'm doing it on purpose. Why am I doing it on purpose? Like, well, that's kind of mean. Yeah, it kind of is, right? I'm making these statements because the thing is, in order for you to say that I'm wrong, you now have to go think about it for yourself. And that's all I care about. Like, I don't care if I'm wrong. I don't care if I make a statement that's wrong. I don't care if I make an absolute claim and I'm wrong. That's going to happen. So I'm okay with that. The question is, can you knock my statement down or not? Because if you can't, maybe I'm right. And I'm doing that. I'm deliberately provoking on those grounds to make people think. And that's what works. As it turns out, you asked me does this work? Yeah, it does. And that's why. And that's how it works.
It's just that you provoke so swiftly with one thing after another, building on themselves in your mind. But when I'm listening, I would have to go back and play this at half speed to follow even the train of thought of how you got to the initial statement without even knowing what the backstory is. So
but you want to crack people open when you're dealing with new ideas, and especially with people who are stuck. And the people who are most stuck are the ones that are most, we'll say, susceptible to logical argumentation, right? Instead of spiritual argumentation. And so when you're dealing with people who are stuck, you have to crack them open. So in other words, you have to leave them with enough cracks in their assumptions such that they're willing to listen to you. So because they can hear you, right? They've got the video on. Are you listening to the video though? Because a lot of times people aren't. And I'm as guilty of this as anyone, right? Sometimes you're just not listening. You can hear it, but you're not listening. And so making those sharp statements with that slightly sardonic laugh and everything else cracks people open, right? And then once you crack them open, now they have to listen. Right? Because if you confront somebody, and this was the point earlier about Philia Nikeia versus Philia Sophia, you need Philia Nikeia, if for nothing else than to signal to people, no, I have a stance, and I'm taking the stance, and here's where it is, so that they know where they stand in relation to you, and otherwise you can't have a disagreement. And like, that's bad, actually. You want to have disagreement because you want to have to prove your point. Otherwise, do you own your point? If you haven't wrestled with the idea, do you own it? And then we're back to beware of unearned wisdom. And so I do what I do very deliberately. And I mentioned that in the Petkow talk. I'm like, I tend to think a few people know how subversive I am and they agree with my methods, because otherwise they'd probably kill me just out of the sheer fear. Fair enough. Yeah, so it is part of the strategy is to get people, listening and actually engaging with their own thoughts. Like, I don't care if you disagree with me. It makes no difference to me. I don't know who you are, roughly speaking. And it's not equally true for everybody, obviously, but and generally, we had somebody come in the other day and he tried to make me upset. He admitted this. He deliberately tried to manipulate me into being upset. The problem is I don't know him. I don't care about him. And so I didn't care about his opinion. And he's like, I think you're being condescending. And I can assure you I was not being condescending, but, and part of that's interpretation. But he was perplexed when I just didn't care. I was like, oh, okay. Sorry you feel that way, but, no, I'm not going to change. So where's next? And he didn't like it at all. But he came back. So interestingly enough, he couldn't stay away, even though he felt like highly insulted by the fact that I didn't care about him, roughly speaking. And these tactics work. They're not horribly effective, but they are effective, and they're fairly consistent. They don't give you a consistent good result, but they give you a consistent result, which is important.
So we covered the part about the objective world is dead material, and we are attempting to distort for the consumption of power. And maybe we don't need to go through the next section where they're still talking about Heidegger's turn to Nazism. But Peterson talks about there being a romanticism to extremist movements that the propositional world still doesn't grasp, which I thought was an interesting point, that there's a romanticism to extremist movements that the propositional world doesn't grasp.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems that he's implying that there's an extremism to romantics, but not an extremism in the propositional world. But it seems to me that there's extremism on both sides, right?
Yeah, I think it is probably the easiest framing to use is enchantment, right? So when you disenchant things by making them just dead objects, right? You can't have enchantment because they're dead and they're objects. Then you need to put that back somehow, because what's animating the objects? Because they're clearly animated, right? Like it's not, or we clearly treat them as animated because we're moving through the world. And so where's that coming from, right? So you have to reintroduce that enchantment somehow. And where and how do you do that? And that, I think, is the point. Like, oh, is it romanticism? Is it mysticism? What's really the difference between those two? Because to some extent, there's a lot of crossover, right? And what's the interaction there? And I think that's right. When the extremist movements seem to be born of the need for re-enchantment. And therefore, everybody that gets involved with them by default becomes enchanted, because that's what they're looking for. They're like, they know it's missing.
So back that up and say it again. The extremist movements seem to be.
What happens with the extremist movements is that they seem to be looking for enchantment. And so they become enchanted by the movement itself.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, I could make several. I don't know which road I want to go down here. So
yeah,
I have a video.
If you can.
I have a video on my YouTube channel. Oh wait, it's not up yet. Actually, I recorded a video for my YouTube channel, Navigating Patterns, where what I'm going to talk about are the three great religions of today. Obviously being a little tongue in cheek there, right? And so one of them is safety. So there's the safety religion, where the highest virtue, the highest value, the highest goal is safety at all costs. Yeah. And then if you're away from safety, right, then you're anti-vax, because vax represents safety. And so their standard of purity is vaccine. Right. And so how do you know that you have a vaccine? You have a vaccine card. That's the way they're acting. And so that's an extremist movement that has a mystical component, and they've all been enchanted by it. And they're stuck in a religious framework, because we're all stuck in religious frameworks. You don't have a choice. You can't just say, no more religion for me. Right. Then that's what happens, is that you end up enchanted by this idea that it's us versus them, and we're the pure people because we have the card that says you are pure, you've been stamped pure, right? It's all right there. And there's the Puritanism, right, or the perfection, same thing. Perfection is non-religious purity. So scientific purity is called perfection, right? It's all there. It's all there. It's just a mini version of a regular
the extremism
church.
is on both sides, and the enchantment is on both sides.
Well, I actually think there's only one side. It's just that the one side casts everybody who isn't them as the other side. It's like, well, maybe, but maybe they don't have anything in common, right? Because maybe, and there's a meme out there now where, it's got this Gaussian curve, right? This regular bell curve, and on one side it's graded out by IQ on the bottom, and on one side there's somebody of 80 IQ or whatever saying, "Oh, the vaccine! I think they're putting a microchip in it, right?" Which is just a stupid argument. Fair enough. And then you've got the people in the middle, like vaccines are great and they keep people safe, sort of thing. And then on the other side, you've got the people of super high IQ, not the average IQ people, the high IQ people. And they're saying, well, we really haven't done any long-term studies. And so, right, and do you lump the stupid people in with the really smart people? No, right? And so from the perspective of the people in the church, everybody outside of the church is a different group, and they're one group because they're not us. But I don't think that's actually true, because there's lots of reasons why people don't want to take the vaccine, and those people don't agree on anything else. So the fact that they aren't taking a vaccine, but they don't agree on why, means they're not one group, or at least that you can make them one group, but that's a bad way of, that's bad framing. It's a bad way of thinking about it. And this is, they do talk about that bad framing in this section, right? They're talking about, oh, it's bad framing. It's like, well, yeah, it's bad framing, but there's lots of ways to make bad framing. And it looks like there's two groups, but there's no way there's two groups, vax and anti-vax. That just, first of all, the vaccine people don't identify themselves as vax, which is really interesting. They just identify against people who won't take the vaccine, which is a very strange thing to do, right? Rather than claiming an identity for yourself, saying, I'm pure because I have a card and I took a shot. You're saying, I'm pure because I'm not one of those people who doesn't have a card and didn't take a shot, or doesn't like the shot, or, whatever. Or even some of them did take the shot and they're still speaking up against the church of safety. And so they're on the outs too. So it's not one group.
That's a common pattern. I mean, we've seen that same pattern in political parties and everything else. That's really interesting. That's a very interesting framing. It's like, I'm not gonna acknowledge my own position. I'm just gonna be against their position. Tomorrow I'm gonna have a conversation with this Hyun Chu guy that had the conversation with Paul the other day. And I've been following his Twitter feed, and one of his tweets, he makes this point that there seems to be this thing where we've set up right now where there are a select group of people who are trying to make B feel like they're being oppressed by A and get them to rise up against A. But I'm not an A and I am not a B. I'm just a disinterested observer.
Right.
But in actuality, my underlying motivation is, if I can get B to rise up against A, then I can be up here and be in control of everything, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I have a video on this binary thinking, right? And we have this binary thinking and why and where it roughly comes from the scientific framework, actually. And once you're trapped in it, you're stuck, but you can break out of it, right? And I use some of those examples, actually, some of the same examples.
It makes it very easy to get played, because you want to find somebody to identify with. And if you can't identify with either A and B, you find yourself identifying with this person who's kind of got this outside framework, but you don't realize what their motivation is, which is probably what happened to Heidegger, that the Nazis came along and he felt like, okay, I kind of see what they're going about, what their point is. And part of it looks good to me, and I can get in there and I can be a part of that without recognizing that they had a different long-term goal than he did. But meanwhile, he had gotten himself muddied up with it. Apparently in later years, he tried to say that within a year or two, he saw what was going on and tried to pull out, but by that time it was impossible. So.
Yeah, no, it's not impossible.
Yeah.
You can always go to the lions. That's an option.
Yes. Yeah, that's the option. I mean, that's the option that many of us, when I say us, I mean people who really care about truth. And I hope there are many of us, but we're all going to be facing that option, or our descendants are going to be facing that option. Or maybe tomorrow. We have no way of knowing.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, there was another way out. You were just too selfish to take it. And it might not have ended that way. Right. But yeah, Christians meet lions. That's what you're supposed to do. Sorry, guys. You signed up.
Yeah. So that's the romanticism and the extremist movements. And then he goes on to talk about that whole purity issue, which you just mentioned.
Yeah, that pattern's everywhere, with purity and evil and goodness and making a distinction, right? So here's our thing, here's the thing that's representative of it, cards, shots, whatever it is, but safety is the highest thing, and therefore, right? And the safety religion plays out in other ways too. Like, oh, we need a safe space, right? That's another safety religion, right? But it's different manifestation of exactly the same pattern. And there's other patterns. There's climate, right? There's like, oh, climate's the most important thing, and therefore we need to kill a bunch of people because Otherwise, the planet's unsustainable. That's the
Well, that's the whole safety thing again, though, right?
well, no, I mean, climate's different from safety, right? Because they're not trying to protect people; they're trying to protect the planet over people, right? Whereas at least the vax anti-vax religion and the LGBTQYXZ plus religion, they're on safety people. So they're not Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion is we need to kill people off the planet because otherwise the planet will be harmed. And the other ones aren't quite like that.
That is one extreme wing of the climate movement, but I think there's another part of the climate movement that is, which is what they're trying to build into the children. I'm afraid because you're destroying my future and I'm not going to have a future and things are going to happen and I'm going to get hurt and there's not going to be enough for me. And they are creating that fear. They're creating, I mean, maybe the whole thing isn't just safety, it's wrapped around fear somehow, because I mean, fear goes all the way back to the garden, right? Fear of not having enough, fear of fear of God not knowing what I need. And so that kind of fear leads to a lack of gratitude, and that lack of gratitude leads to susceptibility to the enemy's attempt to enchant in the wrong direction, let's say.
Right. Or their ability to do so. Yeah, you can always prey on someone's fear and uncertainty, and right, except people like me who are well in touch with it and they're like, yeah, no, it's not going to work. Good luck to you, buddy. Yeah. And people have tried that before. I mean, people have said like, aren't you afraid of war? And I'm like, no, I think war's great. Bring it on. And they're like, oh, and I'm like, yeah, I'm just not afraid of war. Sorry. It's inevitable. So I don't fear it. Right. Are you afraid of death? No. And I talked about this with Chris, is that the problem is people often come in and they've got this argument like, well, what if somebody puts a gun to your head and they say you have to lie or else? I say, I tell the truth and take my chance that they're not going to pull the trigger. And if they do, say la vie. And they don't like that answer because that's not what they do. And so then they think I'm a liar. And I'm like, no. I can give you many instances where I told the truth and it hurt me badly. And I'm not mad about that. I'm not upset. I have no regrets. I will take the hit and it sucks, but I'll do it. And I've done it before and I'll do it again. And if my life's on the line, then c'est la vie, because you don't have a choice as to whether or not to die. You only have a choice of how.
Mm-hmm.
You can stand up for what you believe in and die that way or not. I'm going to stand up for what I believe in and die that way, irrespective of.
Well, I mean, that goes back to Peterson's statement that fundamentally you have to believe in the goodness of being. And if you believe in the goodness of being, then you believe that when you speak the truth, what will come, the consequences that will arise will be the best of all possible consequences because you spoke the truth. Right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. And John has since stated that he believes that being is good, although not quite so quickly as one might hope. It took a while to get there. But yeah. So it's at least he's there. That's a good start.
Mm-hmm. So let's see where we're at with the conversation. Why aren't we? There we go. Okay, sorry. We're going to move ahead just a little bit because I think we can skip over a little bit of it.
Yeah.
Attracted by the original, I mean, we forget this too because of the later deals that Hitler made. But and this is why. What's the leader of the brown shirts? I can't remember the essay.
Owsley? Owsley?
No. In
where?
Germany.
Mussolini.
I can't remember. He's German, and he called for when the Nazis had taken power, he called for the second revolution against the capitalists and against the technology. Nazism.
Kampfsineer?
No, I think it's something like Rom or something like that. The head of the SA, the brown shirt.
Okay. Well, I guess it doesn't matter. Okay, so there's a secondary revolution.
Well,
okay, please expound.
And that's why he's assassinated in the Night of Long Knives, because Hitler realized that if the second revolution happened, he would piss off the industrialists. He would piss off the technology that he needed, and so that's why That's one of the reasons for the night of the long knives when they're all assassinated. And we have to remember that Nazis were assassinated.
Because the second revolution was being plotted?
He was off. The guy that was the head of the SA was pushing for the second revolution, right? And because
and the second revolution. Sorry, I need to know more about that, because this is something I don't know obviously enough about.
Well, so if you read Heidegger, there's not only there's a nature romanticism, but there's also an agrarian romanticism. There's that getting back to the soil. And you notice the blood and soil, also getting back to the soil and getting back to the earth, and right. And
so that's all a call out of the propositional, but
yes,
it's a pathological call out of the propositional.
Very much
or it
so.
becomes pathological.
Yes.
Maybe that's because it doesn't find its proper expression in logos. Because I often think of Hitler. Hitler uses his logos antithetically. Right? He has the gift of the word, but he perverts it and subverts it to the service of power.
Okay, so right there, a pathological call out of the propositional. It doesn't find its proper expression in logos. Hitler uses his logos antithetically, subverting it to the service of power. A pathological call out of the propositional, which doesn't find its proper expression in logos. How would you parse that?
Yeah, and this is one of those areas where I'm like, man, you guys have complicated framing for simple things. I can't follow, because he's not making, right, he's making a claim without really backing it up, right? He's just saying this happened. And I can see why he thinks that happened. I think, again, the problem is you in order to go there, you have to presuppose that Hitler was wrong. And the problem with presupposing that Hitler was wrong is that by what standard? Because by a scientific propositional standard, Hitler was not incorrect. Everything he said was true and correct. He's unethical. That's a different problem. Like, from a moral standard, from an ethical standard, he was wrong, but not. There's nothing about eugenics that is scientifically incorrect. Eugenics is scientifically sound, it's logical, rational, and reasonable. It's just evil, right?
Which is the weakness of pure science in the box.
Right, exactly. Is that if you don't, and Peterson makes this point, right? Don't cross Ebola and anthrax, right? Because you'll have a highly contagious, weaponized, deadly disease that kills its host.
Don't support gain of function on viruses. Right?
That's another idea. Yeah, don't try to speed up evolution to get in front of it. That's kind of stupid, right? But yeah, whatever. I mean, we live in this world where people think that speeding something up to get in front of it is a good idea without realizing it might be on a clock, guys. And if all you're doing is speeding up the clock, you're not changing anything. You're just making it happen faster. So
that's what happens every time I see those Boston Dynamics dogs.
Yeah, another questionable thing. But I think that the right framing to use is to say, if you're going to look at this quote purely scientifically, which is not possible, then it will get bent to your shadow, whatever your deepest, darkest desire is. And so if you really believe that the master race is out there and that you're going to lead the master race to victory over the world, and that's going to bring forth the utopia, which that's perfectly rational. What will really happen is that you will be you will have to be the tyrant and the owner of the world. Now, I think Hitler knew all that, and Stalin too, and we're comfortable with it because they were in Brussels at the same time, in the same cafes, being taught by the same reprehensible French intellectuals. So I think they knew what they were doing. And that's why it was antithetical to logos, because Hitler knew where he was going and where he wanted to go and how to get there. And deliberately.
The other thing that makes it antithetical to logos is that the ultimate consequence of utopia is always coercion, is always the will to power. It has to be, because utopia is not reality. And that's the opposition to reality.
Right.
Because reality is not coercion and the will to power.
Right. Yeah, that's just bad framing. And I think that the fundamental problem, if you want to make an evolutionary argument against this, you can say having a perfect race is anti-evolution, because evolution is all about change and spreading things out and taking as many random bets as you can across a widest space as possible. That's how evolution functions. That's like the process of evolution creates that result. Now, we don't see that because all the data we have on evolution is hindsight bias and sample bias. The samples of evolution are only the things that survived. So we don't see all the mutations that failed. We have no idea how many different types of mammals were created by evolutionary process that we have no record of. We can't know that.
That was a question I asked myself the other day. What happened to all the failures? Why don't we see them?
Well, they don't live long enough to get fossilized, right? So we have a fossil record of the dinosaurs, right? But how far apart are those fossils in time? Like, do we have a continuous 10,000 year fossil record? No, we don't. We don't have anything like that. I don't even think we have.
Oh, wait a minute.
I think
wait a minute now. Hold on. I'm going to go off stop share here because we're on something that I've thought a lot about. So you just said they don't survive long enough to get fossilized.
Yeah.
How long does something have to survive to get fossilized? You're saying that they never survive past the.
Well, it depends. Some of them had small communities.
Cells.
Some of them had small communities. Some of them were stillborn, right? So they just they didn't exist. They didn't, there was nothing to fossilize, right? Some of them like right away, right? Some of them.
So survival of the fittest happens in the fetal stage?
Oh yeah, of course it does.
Only.
Yeah, people's
only.
It's so no, not only. It happens at all levels.
The pictures we see all the time in the textbooks are these animals duking it out on the plane, and the one that's the strongest is the one that wins.
Well, and it's
what happened to the other guy who wasn't fit because he didn't have the right piece in his eye or in his ear, or his neck wasn't long enough or whatever. Where are those fossils?
Right. Well, hey, those creatures get eaten, and bones actually get eaten in most cases, by the way. A lot of people don't know that, especially back in the day. Almost everything was strong enough to crush bone with its jaw. So like bones couldn't be fossilized. But yeah, fittedness is along a bunch of axes, not one or two. Like there's fittedness to the physical atmosphere. There's fittedness to the climate in the space that you're in. So you could be born a human and super sensitive to cold, and then you won't survive in Canada. Like that happens. That happens today. That happens all the time, right? So there's other fittednesses too. So if you have asthma, guess what? You'd better move to Arizona, right? Because your life expectancy will go up in the drier climate. Who knew that, right? And so your fittedness is on all these axes that you can't even imagine. There's so many axes of fittedness. And you're right. At once, we have this very complicated idea of evolution, which is extraordinarily simple. Right? Everybody complicates it, for whatever reason. I guess they want to feel smart. Smart people tend to complicate simple things. And then, but when we think about the components of evolution, we think they're way simpler than they are because we just kind of miss this forest for the trees, right? We kind of reverse them. So there's all kinds of fittedness, and things that don't make it. And they don't make it not for one reason, but for hundreds of reasons, or at least the possibility is any one of hundreds of reasons could make them not make it. And so even if you get, well, let's suppose you get, and we've actually found, I think just recently, actually, they found yet another group of humans they didn't know existed. Why? Because they hadn't found the fossils until now. And that's the other factor. The fossils may be there, but we don't have them all. Oh, who knows? So we don't have a complete record. But even that record is going to be super incomplete, right? We're talking about a sample size of less than 1% across all creatures that have lived. In fact, the sample size is so small that, again, if you wanted to take statistics seriously, you wouldn't even look at fossils. You wouldn't waste your time. It's just noise because it's so small. Now, that's not to say there isn't extractable data, but if you're trying to extract the data about the nature and number of creatures that have been tried by evolution, you're not going to do it by sampling historical data that we have access to, because we just don't have access to most of it.
I can tell we're going to have another conversation about this one in the future, because there's a lot more than we can tackle today, because today we have a particular goal. But I mean, I would be interested in having a conversation with you about this sometime in the future, because I do have a lot of questions. So let's move on to 224, because I think that's a really important point in the video. 224, right about here, maybe.
right? The mystery, and it's important, and that's wrapped up with his own building of his own mystique.
Here he's saying that Heidegger thought he could manage the Nazi thing because he was always attracted to his own nebulous gravitas, that there's a mystery and it's important, built up with his own mystique.
The great thinker that I know how to constantly move for. Right?
Oh, that's interesting. So I see. So you think he also got caught up in a kind of egotism that the Nazis called to. That's interesting, because that's a very dangerous thing for a thinker, because the first thing you should think if you're a thinker is that what you don't know is a lot more than what you know, and you almost know nothing. And so you don't want to. Yeah, well, you know, in Jung's relations between the ego and the unconscious, he discusses that in great detail, how to not be taken over with the ideal once you're beginning to allow it to manifest itself within you, or even when it forces itself upon you, to never identify with the sun. You're not the sun. You might be revolving around the sun, but you're not the sun.
Yeah, Icarus.
S-U-N.
Yeah.
And so,
and Plato says you.
So it's a very dangerous thing, because the first thing you should do as a thinker is recognize that you don't know very much. What you don't know is a lot more than what you know.
Yes. Yeah. It's that call to humility, or the way I phrase it is, you're a Muppet, right? You're just a Muppet. I'm a Muppet. We don't know anything. We're just Muppets, right? And it doesn't matter, quote, how smart you are, how smart you think you are. The world's so big that you know almost nothing of it. And yet you're able to survive. That's the good news. And you should embrace that attitude. And it's interesting because John, it's hard to hear, but John invoked, that I think he called it Socratic humility, right? And people who adopt Plato and Aristotle kind of start at Plato and Aristotle, but you can't. You have to start at Socrates, because he's the one that laid the groundwork. And when you start at Plato and Aristotle, you're in some sense starting in the middle of the story, and you're missing that groundwork, that came from Pythagoras and Socrates. And Socrates is probably the most important, because he does go into this, like this whole Socratic method is, I have no idea what the answer is, but I know how to ask good questions. And that's the only thing a good thinker should do, is be able to ask good questions, not have good answers. That's ridiculous.
Well, now that's a very interesting thought, because Jordan Peterson is always saying that the question is the gift. And I thought about that a lot, because it works on many axes. One of the axes that it works on is once you have a question, you know where to go with your life. You know what your next move is. Peterson was having a conversation the other day with this academic. He worked in terror management and a whole bunch of other things, psychology, and very interesting conversation. But he talked about his trajectory through graduate school and how he moved from one discipline to another as he went through, because his questions kept changing. And ultimately, one of the questions he came to is, what about nostalgia? What role does nostalgia play in our lives? And so he started doing a lot of study about that. So in each instance, the question was the gift that set him on a trail to get new information, to gain new wisdom, to find some new things that he could add into the world. And I kind of tie that up with when Peterson is always talking about this little glimmer of interest that's out in front of you that says, come here, it's your future calling you forward, right? The question is a gift. And in my mind, that's also tied up somehow with this whole issue of the role of anomaly. I've been rereading chapter 4 again in Maps of Meaning. and there's just so much there that the anomaly, your being homeless and living in a car was one of the anomalies that you had to get through in your life that gained you wisdom and strength and all of it, and an ability to see patterns and all of these other things, right?
Right.
But yeah. There's one of the questions is, one of the big questions that people always ask, I think the correct theological term is theodicy. Why is there pain in the world? Why would a good God create pain and suffering, right? It's all tied up there together somehow.
Well, yeah, and when you're expressing a question, what are you doing? That's an expression of aspiration, because you want an answer. And there's a difference between questioning and causing people to question. And so I'll harken back to what I said earlier about my tactic, right? I cause people to question. Why? Because I make hard and fast statements about reality, and that forces them to think about that. They can disagree with me. That's fine. I don't care. I don't know you. I don't care if you disagree with me, but at least you're thinking about it now too. And I think that's better. Even if I'm wrong, if more people are thinking about it, then more people will be able to find out where I'm wrong and then express it to me, and then we both win, or we all win.
Okay, so roll that back a second and tell me, we began with the idea that Kant did a big no-no when he changed the question from why does God,
Well,
does
yeah,
God, from
reflecting the conditions under which it operates, right? So instead of asking about God, you're asking, why do I think of God?
yes,
Right?
okay.
But that's a rejection
which basically
of.
is a question of, is there a God? I mean, why do I think about him is basically, is there, right?
No, it's not. Why do I think about him? See, and this is the thing. It's not the opposite. That's the problem. It's not the opposite. It's a different position. And the opposite is easily answered by the positive, right? The negative is apparent by the positive, but this isn't.
Okay.
Right. And so, and this is my problem with John's idea of this whole idea of non-theism. It's like, you're not reframing anything, and the non-theists don't work that way. The fact that after they had an answer for God, they then tried to look outside of God to find its bounds is different from what John's saying when he says, I want to be a non-theist. I'm never going to look at God. I'm just going to look outside of God. It's like, how would you define outside of God if you didn't look at God first to figure out where the outside was? So you're trapped in the same atheist-theist framework, even though you think you're not.
So is that different from looking at the negative and positive space? No,
it's not, but you have to acknowledge the positive space to define the negative space. Like, the positive space has to come first.
So one of the things that they teach you in drawing is that if you want to draw something that comes closer to reality, you don't try to draw the positive thing itself, because if you're trying to draw the positive thing itself, it brings to mind all your propositional thinking, all of your old understandings of how things, it engages your left brain, right? All your biases come into play. But if you draw the negative space around the object, then you're going to get a clearer picture of the object. You still have to acknowledge that the object is there, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. If you start at the beginning instead of the middle, you have to acknowledge that the object is there. And that's very much what the non-theist church fathers did. They started from the premise of God and then said, we're going to look outside of the premise of God to find the edges of God. Well, you couldn't find the edges if you didn't postulate the thing. That's why the positive articulation matters and comes first. You can't use the negative articulation to define things. Work. You can use it once you've made the positive articulation to make the thing better or sharper or whatever, but you can't start there. Where you start actually matters. And that's why I crack people open by making hard and fast absolutist claims, because then they question themselves. They go, oh, wait a minute. That's not true. It's like, well, are you sure that's not true? Now you have to think about it. And so you're putting them in a positive direction by making a claim that they have to make a negative against.
You're giving them the gift of the question.
Of questioning per se. I think I am.
Yeah.
I think I am. Yeah. And look, I mean, it's tough on me because people are constantly going, you said that and that wasn't true and you're condemning people. And I'm like, maybe, but I just don't care. Sorry. I'm on a mission and I'm going to do what I do because I think it works and it seems to work pretty reliably. So,
let's go back because they're on a roll here. And I think that we're going to see some things that fit in with what we're talking about here.
Right.
point of
Classic
egotism.
hero myth.
Yeah, the egotism. Rakowski argues that he does some of Heidegger's letter about around the period when he's turning in his interpretation of Plato, and while he says, this is, paraphrasing with considerable liberty, but Heidegger basically says, I'm having trouble. I'm sort of worried because I'm really understanding Plato, and there's nothing for me to say. There's nothing for me to say. And then he turns.
Heidegger says that.
Yes. And then he turns and then he says, no, wait.
There's nothing for my ego to say.
Yes, right. And then, no, Plato is actually the villain of the story of the history of metaphysics. Plato turns being into metaphysics and launches us down the
so he finds a convenient demon and puts himself in as a counterposition.
Yeah, and I think that desensitizes him to the Socratic dimension.
And that's driven by egotism.
Yeah,
and that's the hook for the Nazis.
I think so. And I mean, and one of the
inner totalitarian has to welcome the outer totalitarian.
Oh, that's well said. That's very well said.
Yeah, right. The inner totalitarian has to welcome the outer totalitarian. How much do we see that today? Twitter is just full of inner totalitarians.
Exactly.
Yeah, it looks like we're waiting for the outer totalitarian to arise.
I like that.
Yes, well, that's what makes me skeptical about people who claim that power structures human relations. Is that a proposition or a confession, dear sir? Mm. And I had this really interesting experience, John. I was debating Slavoj Žižek.
Yeah.
And I started with a critique of the Communist Manifesto, which, according to my critics, only indicated my rabid ignorance of Marx. But despite that, I thought it was a central document in all of my ignorance. And I talked about its call to bloody, violent revolution. And a quarter of the audience laughed and cheered. And it stopped me in my tracks for like 5 seconds. I thought Freud should be here to hear and Jung as well, to hear the Freudian slip, but to hear the collective unconscious manifest itself so clearly in the relative secrecy of the crowd. And so is it that power structures human relations, my dear Marxist postmodernists, or is it that that's the inner totalitarian within you cheering the outer totalitarian on and justifying it? Because if power is the fundamental motivation, then why shouldn't I use my will to power as my fundamental motivation? Or if I do use my will to power as my fundamental motivation, why shouldn't I justify that by the criticism that is, in fact, once the blinders are off, the central human motivation, and therefore I'm entirely justified in my attempts, just like all the great people throughout time. And that's what's riveting our culture apart, I believe.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think the glorification of power. I would say that they're just like Heidegger.
The deification of power as the ultimate motivational personality.
So why do you think he says why did he correct John from the glorification of power to the deification of power?
Well, this goes back to framing, right? So that's really what he's after, right? So if you think about Peterson's core thesis, right, or one of them, is that it's the postmodern neo-Marxism critique, which I think is correct. That's correct. They're postmodern neo-Marxists, and what that means is that they're using a bad frame, and their frame is power is what runs the world. Fair enough. And in order for that to be a frame about a worldview that you hold, it has to be a deity. So I think he's just being precise in his language, whereas John is not, because John doesn't like these. John is not, he's been the whole talk, he's been avoiding saying, you're absolutely right, Jordan, you're 100% correct, which again, maybe I'm biased. It seems that way to me. Like Peterson seems to be dead on, despite, we'll say, Hans Georg Müller and some of his ridiculous recapitulations of Peterson. His critiques are not good critiques at all of Peterson. I have good critiques of Peterson. He does not. Sorry. And I think that's the problem, is that John doesn't want to, and he's Canadian. John's very Canadian. I would say Peterson's less Canadian because he spent time in Boston. That's why that'll kick the Canadian right out of you. Us Bostonians, man, we'll beat the Canadian out of you, no problem. I think that's the fundamental difference. He wants to make it clear this is a worldview problem. This is a grand narrative problem, to use the postmodernist term. This is a problem of you're deifying this concept of power and saying, if I had the power, I'd be God. That's what they're doing. That's exactly what they're doing. And so I think he's just being really precise. And John is, as usual, as he's done through this whole talk, in my opinion, not wanting to make a claim, even though that claim is clear. I don't know how he gets around it, honestly. And maybe he doesn't in his head, but he won't say so publicly because he wants to avoid being political. Fair enough, but I don't think it's avoidable.
Okay, we're almost there. I think we can finish this.
I would say that has a considerable history, and I think it goes back to the rise of, the scientific revolution and the understanding of God. I mean, it predates the scientific revolution. When you get the nominalism of Scotus and Occam, and say there are no real patterns in the world, you denude the world of logos, and then you understand yourself and God as will, right?
So it sounds like he's saying that Scotus and Occam were the point at which, maybe, according to him, that the disenchantment began, denuding the world of patterns. Do you think nominalism was the point that happened?
Yeah, I would say it's still two steps, right? You still have to in order to talk about patterns, you still have to get rid of religion, because I think that's what religion is to some extent, right? The realm of patterns that we navigating patterns, my YouTube channel, that whole realm is, roughly speaking, the religious realm, right? That's on the religious side of the register, or the upper register, if you want to use Van der Klee's language, I think, right? Or it's in the two worlds mythology, it's the spiritual. Right, because science very much doesn't deal with patterns. So, and you can go, oh, well, Mark, there's complexity science. Yeah, fair enough. How new is that, buddy? It's very new. There's information science. Information science doesn't deal with patterns directly. It uses patterns to explain information science, but it doesn't deal with, say, the science of patterns, which I don't think is going to end up able to be a thing, because I don't think science can, at least for all the patterns we care about. So for narrative, which is a pattern we care about, that's why we use it. I don't think you can science your way through narrative, right? You can go back to our model of the 4 Ps and juxtapose it with John's, where we add in the poetic and replace the perspectival entirely, so that it's still 4 Ps, but you've got this element of patterns, recognition of patterns, understanding of patterns, right? Interaction of participation with patterns. And that's what's missing, in my opinion, in John's whole conception. Whereas,
and I talk about this in the series.
Sorry. Yeah. So what I was going to say about that with the whole patterns thing, which maybe I'm going to have to bring us back here. When you were talking just now, I had this sudden picture of something that has happened in certainly in the history of art. If you go back to, well, that's too complicated, but let me just say that in my own artwork, one of the things that I started striving to do about 10, 12 years ago, I was told in my class on creativity that we don't paint things, we paint relationships.
Yeah.
Okay. And I had this idea that, and some of the great artists that were just post-impressionist artists were also playing with this idea of bringing the background forward, so that the background and the foreground are on the same plane. You don't have depth anymore. You don't have form. You just have the background and the foreground playing on the same plane. And there's something about that patterns arise more obviously when the background and foreground are on the same plane. You will notice this if you take a photograph of a landscape or something and you just look at it, you have a hard time seeing where the patterns are in that landscape. You can't really, there's too many things that you're looking at to notice the darks and lights and to notice the shapes and how they fit together. But if you take that photograph and put some tracing paper over the top of it and draw a line where all the edges are, and then draw and kind of shade in the places where the darks and lights play on that plane, and then take that away from the picture, you now have the patterns are obvious to you now that are showing up there because you can't see the depth anymore. The background and foreground have come together. It's a little hard to explain. I should maybe try to do a video on this with actual illustrations. But what that says to me is that the background needs to come back into the foreground in our lives, the enchantment, the knowledge of where we came from, our origin in God needs to come back in and line up with our story so that we can see the patterns again. I mean, to me, that's the picture of re-enchantment, when a re-enchantment that would actually work is when the background and the foreground unite again instead of being all these layers.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense to me. I can just say, yeah, if religion is the background, roughly speaking, then we need to bring it closer to our actions in the day, our participation in the day. And when we do that, the patterns become evident. And then, yeah, you could go on and on. You could say that's why the liturgy in the Orthodox Church works so well, right? Because it flattens everything, and then suddenly all these patterns pop out. And that's what that's what all these rituals are about, right? A ritual as such connects things that normally might not be connected, and therefore reveals the patterns because you can see them more clearly because you're not distracted by the depth. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So there's just a couple more minutes left. We're going to do this.
It's a miracle.
I know. Come on, sound.
That's on the fringes of intelligibility. And that's somebody as sensitive to cultural depth as Shakespeare, and he's getting it. He's really getting it. It's like, what happened?
Right, and if you're an author, by the way, you could equally say, I've read and understood Shakespeare. What is there left for me to say? Yes. And you'd be equally wrong and equally right.
Yeah, I think.
I just love that. I mean, this is a riff on the earlier statement that Heidegger had read all of Plato and felt there was nothing left for him to say. So now Peterson is saying you could read all of Shakespeare and say there's nothing left for me to say, and you'd be equally wrong and equally right, which is like so true. And it reminded me of something I read today, that Montesquieu apparently said that man is everywhere different is as important and true as to say that man is everywhere the same.
Mm-hmm.
Which is I think is another great thing to think about. Anyway, I love that little riff of
Peterson's. So I mean, I think that there had, when we talked about this around the notion of dogma, I mean, if you understand, if you don't understand faith, in the way it is in the Old Testament, faith is to be coupled to God, married to God. It's more like faithfulness than it is the assertion of belief without evidence.
Yes, definitely.
But when you move to that notion of,
okay, I want to show you something here. When he talks about faith in the Old Testament or faithfulness in the Old Testament, he's talking about this word Hesed. So I'm going to put a link to this in the description, because it talks about the whole meaning of this word Hesed, which means loyal love, basically. It's the idea of loyal love. And it's the covenant keeping God. He's the one who keeps covenant. The covenant isn't me and him on both sides of the covenant keeping the covenant. It's supposed to be me and him, but I can't keep my side of the covenant, and he keeps the covenant because of his loyal love. So I'm going to put this in the description so you can read it more carefully, and then we'll finish this up here.
Faith, and we now use the word belief, and we forget that it originally comes from the German beleben, right? Beleben, to give your heart to something. But we now understand it as assertion. And what is assertion? It is an act of will. So at the heart, right, at the heart even of our theology, we have the will to power. And that's why Heidegger's critique of Nietzsche,
rather than the will to humility,
or what Aquinas was trying to save, which is love is right. Love is when the will is moved by something outside of the will, or something like that. But this is why Heidegger's critique of Nietzsche is so profound. I mean, now to say something positive about Heidegger, right? Because Nietzsche says, well, here's this structure of Christianity, and all Nietzsche does is invert it. And the will to power is in both. And Heidegger says, no, you're still bound to it insofar as you're just negating it. What you have to do is, right, try to get outside of it. You have to break the shared presuppositions of both sides. I say something similar with, I think that I want to break free from the shared set of presupposition between the modern theists and the modern atheists. That's why I call myself a non-theist, because I think non-theism is the attempt to say the shared presuppositions are ultimately misframing our relationship with sacredness, and we need to get beyond them. And it's not only a philosophical argument. The mystics, I would say, converge in a position that's very much like non-theism.
Okay, so the rest of this is mainly them graciously saying goodbye to each other. But you probably have something to say about this thing that he says, I want to break free from the shared set of presuppositions between modern theists and modern atheists. The shared presuppositions are ultimately misframing our relationship with sacredness. You tend to think that John is misframing, right?
Well, look, I mean, I don't know how he's squaring that circle, because he doesn't make that case here, and I don't know if he makes it anywhere else. He might.
But the case for the idea of non-theism.
Well, his case, I'll get to that. His case for how that impacts sacredness, because I don't think it does. Like, I don't see the connection. Like, maybe he does. I haven't watched all his stuff by any means. But he's recently, I think, realized, so he did a talk with Paul Vanderklay recently. I don't know if you saw it.
Mm-hmm.
It's excellent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, I saw some movement happening there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I had a chat, Manuel and I had to chat with JP Marceau. And so we were talking about strategies because he's I think he's giving John a little too much credit in some sense, right? I'm like, I don't think John's that on top of what you're talking about. But the move that seemed to be made is roughly, non-theism is the same framing. Because again, non-theism, you're just talking about where God isn't, but you're still stuck in the God frame. And like, John just doesn't want to be stuck there. And I get it. Nobody wants to be stuck there. Why? Because it's submission, and nobody wants to submit. And that's what the core issue is. It's like, if science isn't the highest thing, because I can own science, like it's not really, but like, this is how they believe, right? I can own science. I can know enough science to find the truth all by myself without any of you people. I could do that. That's easy. And so I really want science to win this battle over religion as such. And so all I have to do is break that frame, which again is what Kant did. He said, no. The philosophy doesn't have to be the handmaiden of religion. Nonsense. Yes, it does. Because religion's where aspiration comes from. And I don't think John takes that seriously either. Like, where's the aspiration coming from? It's not coming from science. There isn't an aspiration object over there beaming out little aspiration beams. That's not happening.
I know. I almost every place that I read, when I'm reading some evolutionary biologist or something, they're talking about, and this is moved to do that, and this has the motive to do that, and this motivation, and I'm like, where do all these motivations come from? Or even, just the desire to overcome your hunger. Where does that come from? You can have a feeling of hunger, but where is the desire to overcome it coming from? So the whole aspirational aspect of it, they just don't give any attention to that.
Yeah, they can't afford to, because then their arguments break down, right? Once you invoke
Well, but
aspiration,
so
you're already on
here's
the
where
other
I
side.
think something's missing. There's a complete misunderstanding of what submission is. That's why they're afraid of it.
I think that's fair too, right? Well, but they've been told they don't have to, right? They've been given a path, a very seductive path, and maybe this is the path of the snake. It says you don't have to submit anymore, right? You don't have to. You can know what God knows, and everything will be fine. And it's like, what? Where are you getting that from? You know, oh, no, there's objective material reality. And so once I stand on objective materiality, I know what you're up to. I can see everything. It's all coming up from the bottom. And if you notice, I put a big long posting on the PVK Vervaeke talk on Vervaeke's, on PVK's channel. I'm not going to put it on Vervaeke's channel. I thought about it, but I was like, yeah, I think I'll pass. But I basically you point out a bunch of stuff, but one of them is this idea that you can stand like in the middle of this story, right, and just sort of proceed from there, and everything that John talks about comes from the bottom. And I think he's making a blatant mistake when he talks about Neoplatonism, because he's Neoplatonism, and then he starts talking about emerging from the bottom. And I'm like, John, the book you recommended in the course you gave to us live on YouTube says ascent. That's what it says. Towards the one, ascent, right? So there's a hierarchy in it, and you're supposed to go up the higher. But these are words he's using in the book that John recommended. And then John's sitting there going, no, it all bubbles up from below. And I'm like, what? That's not what Neoplatonism seems to say. I'm not a Neoplatonistic expert, but the book John recommended doesn't say that. It says up. Like, it's not emerging from the bottom. Where is he getting this from? But I think that's what it is, right? He wants to be on the top. If you're on the top, everything emerges from fair enough. I just don't think you can be on the top. That's where I think the error is. Like, yeah, if you could be on the top, you could be on the top, but you can't be on the top.
So I've been thinking the last few days about these, some people call them dipoles, some people call them binaries. These coalescences of two things that are supposedly opposite, and yet there is a reality in which they're the same, or they're so intimately connected. And one of those that was brought to my attention, well, authority and obedience. And I think that would make a good conversation, is to talk about the relationship between authority and obedience. So if you're interested in that, we can do that someday. Or if anybody who's listening wants to have a conversation about authority and obedience, and maybe some of the misunderstandings around submission, we could be talking about that in terms of the church, or in terms of marriage, in terms of friendship, in terms of reading books, or just about anything that you can think of that's relational, which is all of life.
Right.
And we could talk about this binary, or this pole, or this circle, whatever you want to call it, or this hierarchy of authority and obedience.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that. Yeah, and I think there are very few binaries. That's what I postulate in my binaries video on my channel, right? And what you're really dealing with in most cases is a continuum. Mm-hmm. And the continuum has two extremes, right? But then you get into Eastern philosophy very quickly, because it highlights the middle path, right? And so if there's a middle between two things, then there are three things automatically. And people don't get that, right? And so they can't break out of the political frame either, for the same reason.
I'll give you a little clue of where I'm going with this, is that if authority and obedience are some sort of a hierarchy, where authority is what's at the top, and the rest of the hierarchy is obedience, but they're connected at this one point. But then authentic authority is going to have to move down through all of that obedience, because obedience, proper obedience, requires a certain kind of authority. And so it's anyway, I don't want to go into it here, but but that's kind of the picture I'm working from in my head.
Yeah.
Is it's one thing. Authority and obedience are one thing, but the thing is this thing.
Triangle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very much it. Well, what people don't understand, they need to watch or read the coronations, right? That there's the king swears obedience to the will of the people in some form or other, not in those words all the time, but the king always, the difference is each individual person swears obedience to the king, but the king only swears obedience to the higher power, right? In submission to the lower, right?
Yes,
Because
yes.
who else could you, right? You can't go to each individual person and say, "I, your king, promise to," right? You'd have to say it n number of times for population. That's not practical. But if you can say it once to the higher thing that's above both you and the king, then that solves the problem. It squares the circle. So yeah. And I go over that. I have a video on power and I have another one on principalities because I hate those terms. So I divided them up and did videos on them with my definitions, which are a little bit cleaner, I think. And it at least helps you understand the world better. But yeah, it helps to differentiate all these things. That's why I go through the binary video and the models and some of the bad framing. I try to break some of the bad framing or give people better framing for things. Because I take this stuff pretty seriously, right? And a lot of my channel is fixing the cognitive cultural grammar issues, right? Because that's what we have.
So I can see I'm going to have to get over to your channel again and do some more work. Anyway, this has been great, Mark. We got through. We did it.
We did it.
We did it.
Anybody who doubted miracles, there's one for you.
Yeah. So good talking to you. And I look forward to another one. I've got another conversation coming up in 5 minutes on Hegel, Kant, and parking meters. So I got to get going.
Have a great day. Good luck with that one.
Bye-bye.
See ya.